Ned Stark leaned his head against the damp, cold stone of the cell wall and wondered, for the 100th time that day, how the 7 kingdoms had unraveled into such chaos. The stench of old straw and mildew prickled at his nostrils, and in the torchlit darkness he could just make out the shadow of the guard leaning against a pitted iron gate. He felt the press of the manacles on his wrists, cutting into flesh that had been rubbed raw during those endless hours of captivity. In those moments, his mind wandered north to Winterfell, to the frosted wind that nipped one's ears, to the wolves howling at midnight. He was so far from the old god's trees and the comforting hush of ancient pines. Instead, he was surrounded by the unforgiving stone of the Red Keep's dungeons. If he could have changed one thing, it would have been to never accept the position of Hand of the King. But the realm rarely let men like Ned Stark simply live in peace. Since arriving in King's Landing, he had watched good intentions distort and darken, as the vipers in the court coiled around him and squeezed. Cersei's voice still echoed in his mind, taunting him, as if she were behind the bars that confined him, whispering threats of Joffrey's wrath and the might of House Lannister. He had made a fatal misstep, trusting that reason would prevail in King's Landing. At the behest of his honor, he had declared the truth about Joffrey's parentage, intending to place Stannis Baratheon on the Iron Throne. Yet the city had turned on him as swiftly as the snapping jaws of a direwolf. He had lost the respect of the guards, of the council, and, most painfully, had placed his daughters in peril. Sansa was in the Queen's grip and Arya. He prayed she had found some route of escape amid the chaos. Each night in that wretched cell, Ned waited for the footsteps that heralded his execution. He had begun to make his peace with the notion that his life would end at dawn, under the glare of a mocking crowd and the wrathful gaze of a spiteful boy-king. When dawn came and went, he reflected in numb exhaustion that perhaps his end would come at midday. When midday came and went, he clung to the hope of a miracle or, at worst, a swift stroke of the headsman's sword. Afternoon bled into night, and all that changed was the flickering torchlight. It wore on him like a rusted blade, cutting small slivers of his resolve day by day. But fate is a tide rarely predictable, and in the hour just before midnight on what he believed was his 15th day in the dungeons, the heavy grate of the cell door shifted. Ned's eyes snapped open. He could see no reason for a guard to enter at so unusual a time. Perhaps this was the hour of his demise. He hoped only that his death might spare Sansa. Though he had prayed for mercy, the gods had gone silent. The corridor outside his cell was as still as a grave, lit by a single torch that cast ghastly shadows across the floor. The footfalls of more than one man approached, boots echoing against the stone, and then the shape of a tall, broad-shouldered figure appeared. A figure Ned recognized at once. Ser Islandpayne? The shape behind him was smaller, but Ned was unable to glean an identity in the gloom. He braced himself, heart hammering, muttering a final prayer to the old gods. He would not beg, no matter what cruelty they had in store for him. Yet the voice that spoke was not the rasp of an executioner. It was careful, carrying the weight of command. "Lord Stark," it said quietly, "time is short. Get to your feet if you can." The guard was shoved aside and fell with a muffled grunt. Into the threshold stepped none other than Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, Warden of the West, his cold green eyes gleaming like polished jade in the torchlight. Behind him stood 2 soldiers with the golden lion of House Lannister emblazoned on their breastplates. Ned stared, unbelieving. He had expected many things, Cersei's triumphant sneer or Joffrey's vicious grin, but not the presence of Tywin Lannister in the dungeons at midnight. The man exuded an aura of collected power, as though the gloom itself dared not brush against him. There was something about Tywin's bearing that promised a cunning beyond all others, a cunning that Ned Stark had once abhorred. Now, he wondered if that cunning might prove to be his salvation or his doom. "Lord Tywin," Ned managed, his throat raw from disuse. "What trick is this?" He wanted to stand, but his knees were stiff, and he pressed a hand against the clammy stone floor to push himself up. His manacles rattled, and he suppressed a flash of indignity at the situation. Tywin directed one of his soldiers to unlock Ned's chains, while the other kept watch for any sign of trouble. When the iron rings finally fell from Ned's wrists, a surge of relief and pain shot through his arms, and blood surged back into starved joints. He realized that, no matter how this played out, at least he would not die like a caged animal. Tywin cast a glance down the corridor. "We have little time," he said softly, though his voice carried the distinctive ring of authority. "I gave strict orders to the gold cloaks. Most of them are distracted. Cersei is preoccupied with something else, and we must act swiftly. There is more at stake here than you know." His eyes flickered, a hint of impatience revealing itself in the way his lips tightened. Ned tested his weight, standing gingerly on weary legs. "Why?" he demanded, though not angrily. He was simply too exhausted for fury. "Why would you risk Cersei's wrath, and that of your grandson, by freeing me?" A twist of Tywin's mouth might have been called a grim smile. "Because I am not a fool," he replied, "and not so blind with family pride as to ignore the fact that the realm stands on a knife's edge. The boy on the throne is a disaster waiting to happen. I will not see House Lannister undone by his madness." Ned felt the words sink in. The boy on the throne. Joffrey was no true Baratheon, nor was he truly a Lannister in the way Tywin considered pride. He was the product of Cersei's secret with Jaime, and in Tywin's eyes, that secret had become a liability. Perhaps Tywin had gleaned that he could not control Joffrey, that the boy's cruelty could set the realm ablaze. Whatever his motives, Tywin extended a hand toward Ned. "You wanted to unmask the truth," Tywin continued, the torchlight dancing across his sharp features. "You wanted rightful kings to wear the crown. Very well. But the rightful king is not Stannis Baratheon. If we want to preserve the realm, we must find a more amicable path." Ned's heart hammered, uncertain. Aligning himself with Tywin Lannister was an affront to everything that had brought him here. Yet he remembered Sansa, Arya, Robb, and the well-being of the North. Perhaps the best path to save them all lay in forging the unlikeliest alliance. "What are you suggesting?" Ned asked, carefully measuring each word. Tywin turned on his heel and beckoned for Ned to follow. The two Lannister guards led the way, the torch in their hands flickering over the damp stone walls. "Come with me," Tywin said. "I will explain if you can swallow your pride. Otherwise, you will die, and your family along with you." In that moment, Ned felt a spark of fury. The nerve of Tywin Lannister to speak so bluntly. But the man was right. Pride was a currency too expensive to spend when one's daughters were threatened. And if Ned died here, locked and forgotten, Sansa's life would only get worse, her captivity more dire. Arya might be in the wind, but there was no guarantee she would survive the city's labyrinth alone. He clenched his jaw and allowed Tywin's men to guide him, leaving behind the cell door that had threatened to be his final tomb. They pressed through the corridor, tension riding on every breath. The flicker of torches revealed more Lannister men posted at key junctures. A few gold cloaks nodded them through, apparently bribed or sworn to secrecy. Ned wondered how Tywin had managed this infiltration without Cersei's knowledge. But then he realized that the Lord of Casterly Rock had far more resources than even his daughter suspected. Power, in King's Landing, came not just from the throne but from the webs one spun behind closed doors. And Tywin was a master weaver. Ned kept pace, ignoring the protests of his weary body. Every corridor felt like a potential trap. He half expected to see Littlefinger lurking in an alcove, or Varys with his half-smile of secrets. Yet all was quiet except the faint drip of water through cracks in the stone. They slipped out into an open courtyard. Above them, the moon hung low and swollen, illuminating the angles of Tywin's face. "We have a small window," Tywin said, "and I warn you, once you agree to this, there is no turning back. If you betray me, or if you lose your nerve, I will see you ended before your next breath." "That seems equitable," Ned replied, voice tinged with bitter irony. He was too tired to balk. "What do you want of me?" Tywin glanced up at the towering silhouette of the Red Keep, as though he could sense the presence of his dangerous daughter lurking behind those walls. "We will remove Joffrey from the throne," he said calmly. "He has proven uncontrollable, a threat to the stability of the realm and to my house. But it cannot be done by Lannister steel alone. The people already hold us in suspicion. However, if Lord Eddard Stark were to speak on behalf of the realm, if the North recognized the threat Joffrey poses, then, with our combined might, we could unseat him quietly and place a more fitting king on the throne. There are other candidates, after all, and certain alliances we can forge." Ned's breath caught. The notion that Tywin was secretly planning the removal of his own kin from the throne was dizzying. But as he considered the cruelty he had witnessed, the sight of Joffrey ordering men's deaths with boyish glee, he felt a grim relief that at least Tywin saw what Joffrey was. "You want the North's support?" Ned surmised. "Because you can't do it alone without plunging the entire realm into war." Tywin nodded curtly. "I do. And if it does come to open conflict, having the North on our side means we stand a chance. Without it, the Riverlands and the Vale might join the fray, and we would all drown in blood." 1,000 doubts welled in Ned's mind. He had always viewed Tywin Lannister as a ruthless figure, a man who brought ruin to the Riverlands in the past. And yet he could not deny that an alliance with him might be the only way to spare Sansa, to preserve the North, to ensure an end to Joffrey's tyranny. "What choice do I have?" Ned thought. "Honor demands I spare innocent lives, that I protect my children above all. I accept," he heard himself say, the words tasting of iron and regret. "But if I do this, you must swear to me that my daughters will be safe. And you must promise that the North will remain untainted by your men's atrocities." Tywin regarded Ned carefully, the lines of his face carved by years of discipline. "I will swear it," he said. "You have my word. For as long as you stand with me, I will ensure that no harm comes to your daughters." Ned inhaled sharply, aware of the gravity of their arrangement. In a single midnight hour, everything had shifted. He was no longer the honorable lord waiting for death. He was a conspirator, forging an unholy alliance with the very man who had orchestrated so much suffering on behalf of the Lannister name. They departed the Red Keep under the cloak of darkness, guided by Tywin's contingent of loyal men. In the stables, a row of swift horses awaited. Without a sound, Ned mounted one, ignoring the groan of his bruised muscles. Tywin swung onto another with the agility of a man far younger, his expression as unreadable as ever. The small group rode out of the keep through a sally port that led them to the city's outskirts, away from prying eyes. Far beyond the labyrinth of crooked streets, Ned spied the distant glimmer of torches on the main roads. With luck, no one of note would see them slip away. By daybreak, rumors would swirl, but by then Tywin intended to be far from the city's immediate grasp. They traveled through the dark countryside, the horses' hooves muffled by the damp soil. Ned was too exhausted to speak, and Tywin offered no conversation. The night air carried the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind-blown branches. Eventually, they arrived at an abandoned holdfast, its palisade leaning precariously, its gates unguarded and rotted. Within its courtyard, Tywin's men had set up a makeshift camp, torches stuck into the ground. The cluster of red and gold tents bore the proud lion sigil, but there was an air of secrecy and tension in the camp. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes drifting over Ned Stark as if unsure whether he was friend or foe. A large tent near the center served as Tywin's command post. Its entrance flaps were thrown open, revealing a table scattered with parchments and small wooden markers representing lords and armies across the realm. By that table stood Tyrion Lannister, the imp, a goblet of wine in hand. His mismatched eyes sparkled with surprise as he saw Ned Stark enter behind Tywin. "Well, well," Tyrion said, raising his goblet in wry greeting. "Either I've indulged too much, or that truly is the late Eddard Stark, resurrected from the crypts." Ned hesitated. Tyrion had shown moments of mercy in the past, had even aided Ned's family in small ways. But this was a new world he had stepped into. He simply inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Lord Tyrion," he said, his voice worn. Tywin stepped forward, tossing his riding gloves onto the table. We have no time for wit, Tyrion. Summon the men. I want all our officers briefed at once. Our window of opportunity is finite, and we have much to discuss. Tyrion arched an eyebrow but obeyed, sending out a pair of guards to gather the necessary captains. Meanwhile, Tywin turned to Ned. "You should rest," he said. "You look half dead." Ned almost allowed himself a short, humorless laugh at the remark. Instead, he just nodded. "I'll stay awake a little longer," he said. "Rest can wait until I know my daughters are safe." Tywin's lips tightened, but he did not argue. "Very well. We'll ensure you have what you need. And soon we will speak of the path forward." Word spread through the camp. Ned Stark was alive and, impossibly, in alliance with Tywin Lannister. Soldiers who had once viewed the Stark name with hostility now looked on with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Tyrion commanded the meeting in the central tent, and around that table gathered some of the Lannister captains, along with a handful of mercenary leaders. Several cast Ned uneasy glances, but none questioned Tywin's decision. The Lord of Casterly Rock commanded obedience born of both fear and respect. If he said Ned Stark was to be treated as an ally, then that was the end of the discussion. Across the table, Tyrion cleared his throat. "Let us begin, shall we? We have a complicated series of tasks ahead of us. Dethroning Joffrey without letting the entire realm collapse. I take it you've grown tired of the royal brat, father?" Tywin's jaw set rigidly. Tired is too mild a word. He is a liability we cannot afford. Cersei refuses to rein him in. The boy grows more erratic by the day. One of the captains, a broad man with a scar slashing across his cheek, spoke up hesitantly. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but Joffrey is the rightful king, is he not?" A cold tension rippled through the tent. Tywin's gaze bore into the captain, but it was Tyrion who answered, swirling the wine in his goblet. "That depends on how you define rightful. By blood, he's neither Baratheon nor the rightful heir. By public acceptance, he is recognized, for now. But do keep this to yourself, Captain, else it might cost you your tongue." The captain paled and dropped his gaze. Tywin exhaled slowly. "We remove Joffrey quietly. If possible, we aim for a solution that leaves the city intact. I will not see King's Landing sacked. To do this, we require Lord Stark's help. The North must pledge its support to the realm in removing a tyrant. We want the public to believe that we, the Lannisters, are responding to Stark's demand for justice in the name of the Seven Kingdoms. That we have recognized Joffrey's unfitness to rule." Ned watched the interplay in stony silence. To hear Tywin speak so freely of tossing aside his own blood, albeit a tarnished lineage, proved how little personal sentiment guided him. All that mattered to Tywin was maintaining power and ensuring House Lannister survived. "My men in the north," Ned said. "My son Robb. They will not trust easily. They believe the Lannisters responsible for my demise. If I appear at their camp, perhaps I can stop them from launching an assault on King's Landing. But we will need assurances that the Riverlands, the Vale, and my home will be spared." Tywin dipped his head. "You shall have those assurances. I will write to Walder Frey, to Walder's brood, and to the lords of the Riverlands. They will be told that you and I have come to an understanding, peace, in the name of the realm." Tyrion smirked. "Now that is a letter I'd like to see. Dear Lord Frey, we lied about severing Lord Stark's head. Won't you break bread with us?" Tywin silenced him with a glare. "Enough. We have work to do. Lord Stark will ride north with a small escort of my best men, under the pretense of parley. He will reach his son's camp, or the Eyrie if need be, and rally them to our cause." Ned wanted to argue that marching with Lannisters at his back might well provoke Robb into hostilities. But what choice did he have? "I must pray that once they see me alive, they will listen. And if they did not, then any alliance would be dashed, and Ned would likely not survive his own son's wrath." The entire plan was precarious, an edifice of cracked ice spanning a frozen lake. Yet it was the best chance to save his daughters, to stop a war that could claim thousands of lives. As the night waned and the first glimmers of dawn lightened the eastern sky, the meeting ended. Ned's head pulsed with exhaustion. Tywin dismissed the group, ordering them to rest. Tomorrow would begin the real work. Ned finally allowed himself to be led to a small tent set apart from the others, where a cot waited. As he lay down, the stiffness in his limbs throbbing, he thought of Sansa, of Arya, of Robb, Bran, and Rickon. He thought of Catelyn. He thought of the North's wind, cold and pure. And then darkness claimed him for a few hours of dreamless, merciful sleep. When he woke, the sun hung high in a sky of pale blue. Tyrion was there, a plate of bread and cheese in hand. "We didn't want to wake you," the imp said, half in apology. "You looked like a corpse that had finally found a pleasant dream." Ned rubbed his eyes, blinking at the tent's filtered light. "I doubt my dreams were pleasant," he said quietly. "But thank you." He accepted the food, stomach growling in a way he'd nearly forgotten. He ate mechanically, focusing more on the swirl of thoughts in his mind than the taste of bread. After breaking his fast, he ventured outside to find Tywin had assembled a small contingent of knights. They were to ride to Robb's camp as a vanguard, ensuring safe passage for Ned. A silent fear gnawed at Ned's insides. Will Robb even trust these men enough to let them speak? Will my son see me as a broken puppet? But the time for doubts had passed. Before they left, Tywin drew Ned aside, away from the ears of others. "Remember what is at stake," he said softly, though his voice still carried that implacable strength. "You have your honor and your family to concede. But so do I have my house. If you betray me, if you fail to bring the North into this alliance, I will wash my hands of you and handle Joffrey in my own manner. And that manner will not spare Sansa." Ned bristled, fists clenching at his sides. But he managed to contain himself. "I have no intention of betraying you," he said, each word like a stone. "But I swear to you this as well. If you break your word and harm my daughter, I will rain the vengeance of the North upon your house." Tywin seemed to consider his words, a flicker of respect glinting in those green eyes. "So be it," he said. "May the gods be with us both, Lord Stark." With that, Ned set out with a dozen Lannister knights, men who wore the colors of the Golden Lion but showed no open hostility toward him. He suspected that Tywin had chosen the more disciplined among his ranks, those who would not spark a fight with the first northerner they saw. The journey north felt surreal. Only weeks before, had it been weeks, it felt like a lifetime. He had been the king's hand, riding south in hopes of a peaceful resolution. Now he was riding north in secret, an uneasy ally of Tywin Lannister, bent on dethroning the very boy he had once prepared to condemn. He wondered if the gods found humor in these ironies. They passed scattered villages, farmland left scorched by roving war bands. The Riverlands were embroiled in conflict, the aftermath of battles between Lannister forces and the Tully bannermen. Blackened ruins dotted the landscape, and displaced small folk trudged along muddy roads, carrying meager possessions. Some recognized the lion's sigil on the knights' cloaks and shrank back, fear etched into their faces. Ned's heart twisted at the sight. This was the cost of the realm's power struggles. Innocent lives shattered, fields burned, children orphaned. He swore, with renewed conviction, that if this alliance could bring stability, he would see it through. When they finally approached a segment of the Trident, the great river crossing that Robb Stark and his northern army had once contested, Ned felt his heart pound. He remembered crossing this river as a younger man, rallying for Robert's rebellion. Now he came bearing a message of precarious peace. The moment they were spotted by the outriders of the northern host, horns sounded. Within moments, the Lannister knights braced themselves, uncertain whether the northerners would charge. But Ned rode to the front, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. A tall young scout, clad in furs, galloped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Who rides there under the lion banner?" he demanded, voice echoing over the water. Ned lifted the visor of his helm, revealing his face. The scout went pale, his horse skittering sideways. "Gods be good," the scout murmured. "Lord Stark." "Yes," Ned called back, his throat tight. "I am Ned Stark, and I wish to parley with my son." Confusion rippled across the scout's face. He signaled for a few more riders to join him, and they exchanged whispers. Then, as if concluding that no illusions could conjure Ned Stark's visage so convincingly, they nodded. "Follow us," the scout said, voice quieter now. "But your Lannister companions will have to wait at the perimeter." The Lannister knights exchanged anxious glances. Ned turned to them. "Wait here," he ordered, uncertain of his own authority but stepping into it nonetheless. "I will speak to my son alone. No harm will come to me under the banners of House Stark." The captain of the Lannisters, a grizzled man named Ser Martin, hesitated. "Lord Tywin commanded us to keep you safe." Ned allowed a small breath. "I am safer here than anywhere in the realm. If you attempt to ride with me, the Northerners will take it as aggression. Stay behind. I'll return soon enough." Ser Martin glanced at the lines of gray-cloaked archers that had begun to gather on the northern bank. Their arrows notched but held. After a moment he nodded. "As you say, my lord." And so Ned rode across the shallow crossing with only a handful of northern outriders accompanying him. It felt like coming home after a long, painful absence. The crisp bite of the breeze, the smell of damp pine on the air, the sight of winter roses growing in the cracks of stone. He breathed it in, letting it fill his lungs. Even the tension of the moment could not diminish the relief he felt at being among his own. They led him through lines of northern soldiers, men wearing the sigils of White Harbor, the Dreadfort, Carhold, Bear Island, and many other loyal houses. Most stood stunned, gazing at the man they had believed dead. Some dropped to a knee, muttering, "My lord," in awe. Others simply stood frozen, unable to reconcile rumor with reality. The camp was sprawling, lines of tents alternating with makeshift fortifications. And at the center, Ned saw the Stark banner, a gray direwolf on a field of white, fluttering in the afternoon light. Outside the command pavilion, a tall figure stood, arms crossed over the direwolf sigil. Rob. At first glance, Ned almost did not recognize his son. He had grown leaner, harder, the angles of boyishness sharpened into the lines of a young warlord. His auburn hair was longer, tied back from his face. His posture was rigid, as though a single flicker of weakness could unravel him. Catelyn stood to one side, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. The moment she saw Ned, she ran forward, and Ned dismounted just in time to catch her in his arms. The flood of relief, the swirl of heartbreak in her eyes, threatened to undo them both. "Ned," she breathed, voice trembling. "They told us," everyone said. He held her close, inhaling the scent of her hair, so achingly familiar. "I'm alive," he managed, though his voice cracked. For a moment, he allowed himself no other thought but the warmth of her embrace. Behind them, Robb stepped forward. His face was torn between disbelief and anger. "How?" he asked, fighting to keep his composure. "How are you here, father? We heard you had been killed by Joffrey's command." Ned gently separated from Catelyn and turned to Robb, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Joffrey tried, but not all Lannisters agreed with him. I was freed in secret. We have come to an arrangement." Robb's eyes narrowed. "A Lannister arrangement?" He practically spat the word. "They murdered our men. They hold Sansa captive. They..." Ned squeezed his shoulder more firmly. "Listen to me, Robb," he said, voice filled with a gravity that made the young man pause. "There are things you must know. The realm stands at the edge of war, and thousands of innocent souls will perish if we don't put aside vengeance to face a greater threat." The bitterness in Robb's eyes was palpable, but he looked at his father, alive against all odds, and some part of him relented. "Very well," Robb said, swallowing hard. "We will speak as father and son, and you will tell me everything." They withdrew into the command pavilion. Catelyn, still shaken but composed, guided Ned to a chair. Robb took the seat at the head of a wooden table scattered with maps of the Riverlands and the roads leading south. Lords Rickard Karstark, Roose Bolton, the great John Umber, and others began to file in, curiosity etched on their faces. Word had spread that Ned Stark lived. The entire camp seemed to pulse with whispered excitement. "Lord Stark," Rickard Karstark said, inclining his head, "we believed you gone." The North grieved. Ned nodded in acknowledgement. "I grieve for the lives lost already, and we must prevent more needless deaths." Roose Bolton's quiet, careful tone broke in. "You say you were freed by the Lannisters? Forgive me, my lord, but that is difficult to believe." Ned drew a tired breath. "It was Tywin Lannister himself. He believes Joffrey is unfit to rule, a mad boy who will destroy the realm, and the Lannisters with it. So he seeks my alliance, our alliance. In return, he promises Sansa's safety, peace with the North, and a plan to seat a more stable monarch." An uneasy silence followed. The Great John, always the most boisterous, let out a derisive snort. "You'd trust Tywin Lannister over Joffrey Baratheon?" Ned's gaze slid across each lord's face in turn. "Joffrey has Sansa captive. He nearly killed me. He has no respect for any code of honor. Tywin, for all his ruthlessness, understands order. He wants to protect House Lannister's reputation and holdings. We can leverage that to our advantage." Karstark shook his head. "He burnt our fields, butchered small folk." Catelyn stepped forward, voice steady but laced with sorrow. "He did. But what alternative do we have? Another open war? Another slaughter where we might lose half our men, half our families?" She placed her hand on Ned's arm. "If Ned is alive, if we can spare Sansa, should we not try to end this conflict before it spreads further?" Robb looked troubled. His hands tightened on the edge of the table. "We came south to rescue you, father, and to avenge the wrong done to House Stark. We declared independence for the North. The men crowned me king in the North." A flicker of pride and heartbreak passed over his features. "All of that, would it be undone now with this alliance?" Ned chose his words carefully. "It need not be undone, Robb. The realm is bigger than one king or one region's desire. If the North truly wishes to remain independent, that is a conversation we can have when the realm is stable. But now chaos reigns. If Joffrey sits the throne, he will bring us ruin. If we rise in open rebellion, the bloodshed will last for years, and Sansa might die in the crossfire." The lords exchanged looks. Some wore expressions of hardened resentment, others an uneasy acceptance. Finally, Roose Bolton spoke again, softly. "And what does Tywin Lannister ask of us in exchange?" Ned's voice was quiet, though it resonated with authority. "He wants the North to stand down from open war. He wants us to publicly decry Joffrey's claim to the throne and support the removal of the boy. He wants us to do so in a way that paints House Lannister as the realm's savior, preventing a tyrant from reigning." "Lies upon lies," said the Great John with a derisive laugh. "If it keeps our sons alive—" He trailed off, uncertain. Robb sank back in his chair, eyes drifting to his mother. Then he turned to Ned. "Father, I'll heed your counsel, but I must see Sansa for myself. I must know that she is truly safe." "She remains in King's Landing for the time being," Ned said quietly. "But Tywin assured me she would not be harmed, and that once Joffrey is removed, we can secure her freedom. We must be cautious. If we storm the city with an army, Joffrey might take his rage out on her before we can reach the throne room." Silence weighed in the tent until Catelyn placed a hand on Robb's. "Your father is alive, my son," she murmured, eyes shining with tears. "And we have a chance to save your sister. Let us not waste it." There was a shifting of loyalties in that moment. The lords saw their beloved liege returned from the brink of death. They respected Ned Stark's wisdom, his honorable reputation. Though Tywin Lannister was the devil to many of them, they could see reason in forging a deal, if it saved them from further devastation. One by one, the lords nodded, some grudging, others hopeful. Robb stood, running a hand over his face as though trying to smooth away the weight of command. "Very well," he said. "We will entertain this alliance. We shall not declare open war on the Lannisters for now. Instead, we will coordinate with Father to quietly depose Joffrey and ensure Sansa's safety. But let us be clear, If Tywin breaks his word, or if he so much as harms a single hair on Sansa's head. Robb's voice turned grim, and the tension in the air thickened. We will bring the fury of the North down upon him. Ned exhaled, relief mingling with dread. The first step was taken. Now they had to walk the perilous road of conspiracy, balancing trust and caution in equal measure. In the days that followed, messages were exchanged covertly between Tywin's camp and Ned's. A network of ravens flew under secret instructions to lords who might support their cause. The plan was to slowly peel away Joffrey's supporters, or at least convince them that remaining loyal to the Boy King was to invite ruin. Tyrion proved instrumental in this, writing letters dripping with half-truths and promises to men like Littlefinger, to the Highgarden Tyrells, and to certain influential figures in the city's power structure. Meanwhile, Ned worked tirelessly to maintain the fragile peace between the Northmen and Lannister men, who now camped in uneasy proximity. Robb oversaw the North's readiness. If the plan failed, they would need to be ready for a swift strike. As the conspirators moved their pieces, Cersei Lannister remained a lurking threat. Tywin's letters indicated that Cersei was suspicious of her father's absence, but she could not guess the extent of his plans. Joffrey continued to hold court in King's Landing, growing more spiteful by the day, lashing out at any who displeased him, including his own Kingsguard. Meanwhile, Sansa's letters, when allowed, reached Ned, carefully worded to hint at her emotional distress, but also to reassure him that, for the moment, she remained unharmed. Eventually, word arrived that Tywin had returned to the city in secrecy. He invited Ned and a small group of trusted Northmen to make their way to a hidden meeting place near the Dragon Pit at night. This invitation was fraught with risk. King's Landing was a pit of vipers, and if any recognized Ned Stark entering the city, the entire plan could collapse. Still, the conspirators agreed that it was the only way to finalize the next stage, removing Joffrey from power. Thus, on a moonless night, Ned found himself slipping into King's Landing once more. Robb remained behind, to lead the northern forces if all went wrong. Ned took with him only a handful of silent, trusted guards, men who would die for him if need be. They dressed in plain cloaks, battered armor, and kept their heads bowed as they entered the city through an old postern gate, bribing the watchman with a hefty purse. The streets were quiet at this hour, though the stench of the alleys and the hush of distant voices reminded Ned of the city's underbelly. They arrived at a decrepit building near the massive ruin of the Dragon Pit. Once a grand structure that housed Targaryen dragons, the dome had long since crumbled, leaving only scorched remnants of its former glory. In the shadow of those broken arches, Tywin awaited, wearing a heavy cloak of black that hid his Lannister armor. His pale green eyes gleamed in the lantern's glow. Tyrion was beside him, adjusting the fit of his hood, while half a dozen discreet men-at-arms circled the perimeter. Ned stepped into the circle of lantern light, ignoring the fear that prickled in his gut. "Lord Tywin," he said, voice hushed. "We have come." Tyrion smiled thinly. "And here I worried you might decide to lead your entire northern host through the gates." Ned did not smile back. "What is the plan?" "Your letters were brief." Tywin glanced around, ensuring no eavesdroppers. The night was still, though the distant barking of dogs and the rustle of wind drifted through the ruins. "We strike at dawn," he said softly. "I have men within the Red Keep who are loyal to me, or paid enough to look the other way. We will secure Joffrey, remove him from the throne, and seize control of the city. All must happen swiftly, before Cersei can react. Once we have Joffrey in hand, we announce that he is not the true heir to the throne, that we have proof of his illegitimacy." Ned's breath caught. "And what proof is that?" Tyrion shrugged. "The same proof you uncovered, Lord Stark. The parentage of Joffrey. My father can no longer shield him, and the city will accept it more readily if House Stark supports the claim." Ned closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the choice bearing down. By exposing the truth, he would bring dishonor to Cersei and Jaime, but also brand the boy as a bastard. Another wave of pity for Sansa rolled through him. But Joffrey was a monster. There was no denying that. The realm would be better off without him. And who do you plan to seat on the throne instead? Ned asked. Stannis? Renly is dead, if the rumors are correct. Tommen or Myrcella? Tywin's expression betrayed a flicker of frustration. We have not yet determined that. Stannis is a capable commander, but he is also rigid, unyielding, and will not easily accept a compromise. Tommen is young, pliable, and if recognized by the faith, might be accepted as Robert's child despite the scandal. Or we might forge a new alliance with the Tyrells and seat Margaery as queen to Tommen. The details matter less than removing Joffrey swiftly. Once the city is under our control, we will force a settlement. The lords of Westeros may grumble, but they will prefer a gentle boy like Tommen over a sadistic whelp. Ned thought of Stannis. The man was cold, but undeniably the rightful heir by law. Tywin, of course, cared little for the actual line of succession if it meant losing power. Perhaps Ned could press for Stannis once Joffrey was toppled. But that discussion could wait. First, they had to secure Sansa and dethrone the Boy King. Very well, Ned said. At dawn, then. Where do you need me? Tywin fixed him with a hard look. At my side in the Red Keep. Your presence will show that this is not a Lannister coup, but a necessary removal of a false king. If you stand with me, the people and the soldiers may hesitate to resist. Ned nodded. Agreed. But I want Sansa taken to safety immediately. Tyrion inclined his head. We'll have men discreetly move her away from the chaos as soon as the deed is done. We'll send her to the Tower of the Hand, perhaps, or better yet, out of the city entirely. She'll be reunited with your family as soon as possible. Ned swallowed, remembering all the times he had failed to protect Sansa in the past. This time would be different. Let's hope so, he said simply. They spent the rest of the night finalizing details, hushed voices echoing through the deserted ruin. Then each party slipped back to their respective hiding places, awaiting the critical hour. Ned found no rest in the hours leading up to dawn. He paced a small courtyard near an inn that Tywin's men had commandeered. The ground was damp with midnight dew, the city quiet but for the occasional distant cry. When the first pale light touched the eastern horizon, the Lannister soldiers stirred, donning armor and checking weapons. Ned took a steadying breath and readied himself, the memory of the last time he entered the Red Keep as a free man flitting through his mind. Everything was about to change. Their group reached the Red Keep by way of a smaller gate, accompanied by men in gold cloaks who had sworn loyalty to Tywin or were well bribed. They slipped inside just as the city began its waking rituals. Merchants opening shops, bakers hauling bread, and so forth. Ned felt a tremor of apprehension. All around him loomed the grand halls and towers where his life had nearly ended. In the courtyard, a small group of Lannister guards formed up. Tywin appeared calm, though Ned sensed the tension in the tight line of his mouth. Tyrion was nowhere to be seen, likely occupying a vantage point from which he could direct the next steps. Suddenly, a commotion erupted by the main stairs leading up to the throne room. A dozen gold cloaks marched into the corridor, led by the commander of the city watch. He was an older man with a face hardened by years of politics. He cast a questioning glance at Tywin. Why, Lord?" he said quietly. "The Queen is still Abed. The King. Well, the King is in his chambers." Tywin nodded curtly. "Keep them there. The moment Joffrey emerges, we seize him, quietly if possible. Keep everything orderly. We do not want a bloodbath. I will deal with the Queen. Where is the Kingsguard?" "Ser Meryn is with the King. The Hound left the city on some errand. The others are scattered." Ned suppressed a dark satisfaction at the mention of the Kingsguard's vulnerability. Joffrey had driven away or mistrusted too many of those sworn to protect him. Now it might prove his undoing. They ascended the stairs, the hush in the corridors eerie. Servants scurried out of sight, sensing that something dangerous was afoot. Tywin led the group to a set of large doors that opened into Joffrey's private wing. The gold cloaks there, also bought or loyal to Tywin, stepped aside. Ned's heartbeat thundered. Any moment, Joffrey might appear and unleash a tirade, or Cersei might swoop in with her cunning. But so far, the plan held. Voices drifted from the chamber beyond. Ned recognized the high-pitched petulance of Joffrey's voice, berating someone over some trivial matter. Ser Meryn Trant's gruff replies were barely audible. Tywin signaled for silence, then pushed open the door. Ned and half a dozen men entered the lavish sitting room, dominated by a large window overlooking the city. Golden drapes framed the light, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Joffrey stood by a table covered in lavish sweets, a jeweled cup in hand, wearing a luxurious dressing gown. He turned, confusion etched on his young features as Tywin marched in. "Grandfather," he said sharply, "what is the meaning of this? You dare intrude on my private chambers without—" His words froze as Ned stepped into the light. Joffrey's face blanched, and his eyes flared with sudden fear and fury. You're supposed to be dead," he spat, voice cracking. Ser Meryn sprang forward, sword half-drawn. But Tywin's men were faster, half a dozen spears pointing at the Kingsguard's chest. Meryn hesitated. Joffrey's eyes darted wildly. He dropped his cup, spilling wine across the floor in a crimson puddle. Ned's voice came out calm, though inside he felt a roiling sea of emotions. "King Joffrey," he said, "in the name of the realm, we are removing you from the throne." Joffrey bared his teeth like a cornered animal. "You have no right. Guards! Guards!" His shriek rang out, but no guards came to his aid. The gold cloaks in the corridor had been bought. The castle was, for the moment, under Tywin's control. Tywin stepped forward, his voice edged in steel. "Joffrey Baratheon, I name you a bastard born of incest, and unfit to sit the Iron Throne. Stand down, or you will be taken by force." Joffrey's eyes bulged. His gaze flicked to Ser Meryn, who stood trapped by spears. Then, without warning, Joffrey lunged for a dagger on the table. But Tywin's reflexes were quick, and so were his men's. One soldier slammed the pommel of his sword into Joffrey's wrist, knocking the dagger aside. Joffrey howled, clutching his hand, tears springing to his eyes. The Boy King's cry of rage and pain cut through the chamber. He turned on Ned, face twisted in hatred. "You traitor! I should have had your head on a spike. Ned signaled to a guard, who clamped a hand over Joffrey's mouth. The boy struggled, teeth bared, but was no match for the fully armored soldier. Another guard quickly tied the boy's hands behind his back. Ser Meryn started to protest, only to be disarmed by 3 pikes held to his throat. He had no choice but to surrender. In that tense hush, Tywin exhaled. "Take him to a secure chamber," he ordered. "Keep him under guard. Treat him as you would a prisoner of war. No harm unless he attempts escape." Joffrey's muffled shrieks filled the corridor as he was dragged away, echoing off the stone walls. Ser Meryn was stripped of his sword and marched out behind him. Ned stood there, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. The monstrous boy was in custody, but Cersei was still free, and the next steps would be fraught with danger. Tywin placed a hand on Ned's shoulder. "It's done," he said quietly. "Now, let us find the Queen before she can rally any loyalists." A sudden crash sounded from beyond the chamber door, followed by a woman's voice raised in fury. "Cersei." A new wave of tension swept through the room. Tywin and Ned exchanged grim looks. It seemed the Queen had heard, or sensed, the disturbance in her son's chambers. Now the confrontation with Cersei would begin, and the fate of the realm would hang on the next few minutes. Even so, Ned felt a surge of hope. He had survived the headsman's block, had forged an uneasy alliance with Tywin Lannister, and now Joffrey was deposed. If, by the grace of the gods, they navigated the wrath of Cersei, Sansa would be freed, the realm would be spared from further butchery, and the North could return to a semblance of peace. Yet, as the Queen's furious steps approached, Ned steeled himself for the storm to come. Honor had guided him through the darkest corridors of the Red Keep, and though he was now walking with Tywin Lannister at his side, a man he once swore never to trust, Ned knew there was no turning back. The old gods would judge the choices he made, and if they found him wanting, so be it. The only victory worth seizing was the one that saved his children and preserved the realm from Joffrey's terrors. And so, summoning all the composure he could muster, he stepped forward with Tywin to meet Cersei's wrath, determined to see this coup through to its final outcome. One way or another, the fate of the Seven Kingdoms would be decided, and the name Stark would not be forgotten in the halls of power again. Tywin moved ahead with a measured stride, his cloak swirling about him, and Ned followed close behind. The muffled roar of Joffrey's protests echoed down the corridor, as Lannister guards dragged the boy king away. At any moment, the queen might unleash her own loyalists or try to rouse the gold cloaks who remained true to her. Yet so many had taken Tywin's coin or succumbed to his intimidation that the halls seemed eerily subdued. The Red Keep, once a hive of servants, visiting lords, and hangers-on, now felt tense, as though the very stones held their breath for what would come next. Cersei Lannister swept into view with the poise of a great cat. Head held high, emerald eyes narrowed, golden hair tumbling over her shoulders in disarray. She wore a dressing gown of deep crimson embroidered with delicate gold thread. Behind her hurried a few of her handmaids, faces white with dread, and a single Kingsguard knight, Ser Boros Blunt, sword half-drawn, uncertain whether to step in front of the queen or flee her wrath. The queen's gaze landed on Tywin and Ned with all the fury of a tempest. She drew a sharp breath, lips parted in disbelief. The last man she had expected to see here was Eddard Stark, alive and unbowed. Her voice sliced through the uneasy hush. "Father," she said, forcing a note of haughty disdain. "What madness is this? Why have your men accosted Joffrey? He is the king." Tywin's tone, like tempered steel, cut across hers. "Not any longer," he said. "We have just removed him from the throne, for the sake of House Lannister and the entire realm." Cersei's eyes flared, and for an instant, Ned glimpsed a flicker of raw panic behind their green depths. But she was not a woman who easily yielded to fear. Her next breath steadied, and she lifted her chin in defiance. "You have committed treason," she hissed. "All of you. Do you think you can sweep into King's Landing and dethrone my son without repercussion? I will see you all flayed alive. Ser Boros, cut them down." The Kingsguard knight looked to Tywin, then to Cersei, torn between conflicting loyalties. Tywin's men filled the corridor on either side, spears and halberds at the ready. Ser Boros hesitated, perspiration beading his forehead. He was no seasoned hero of the Kingsguard like Ser Barristan Selmy had once been. He was a bully, a brute, and bullies often cowered before a superior force. When Tywin spoke again, his words rang with finality. "Take her into custody." Several of his men stepped forward, spears raised. Cersei staggered back, disbelief plain on her face, and for a moment, Ned thought she would attempt to flee. Instead, she stood her ground and spat at the nearest guard. "I will see you all ruined," she snarled. "You think you can silence me? You think you can muzzle the truth about this travesty?" Tywin's stare was unyielding. "Be silent, Cersei. You have reigned over madness for too long. Joffrey has proved himself a tyrant, fit to bring ruin on House Lannister if he remained in power. I will not watch our house destroyed for your folly." He spoke as though she were nothing more than a troublesome child in need of chastisement. Ned felt an odd twinge of sympathy, even for Cersei, as she glanced in his direction. The last time their eyes had locked, she had threatened him in the gardens. All those weeks ago, warning him not to cross her. She had told him that when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. In a cruel twist, she was now the one caught unawares. Cersei's voice quavered for the first time. "Father, how could you do this? He is your grandson." "My son." A muscle in Tywin's jaw tightened. "My grandson was Tommen and Myrcella's elder brother, yes," he replied, flat as stone. "But he is also the single greatest threat to us all. Consider yourself fortunate we are content to keep him alive in a secure chamber rather than have him executed for treason against the realm." "Treason against the realm?" Cersei said in a strangled laugh, as if the suggestion were too absurd to contemplate. "He is the king. Any who raise a hand against him commit treason. Ned decided to speak, though every syllable felt like stepping onto thin ice. Cersei, he said carefully, I once warned you to flee with your children, to avoid bloodshed. You chose the path that brought us here. Joffrey is unfit to rule. Too many have died already. There will be no more. She turned on him, lips curled. Your petty northern sense of honor drove you to this, didn't it, Stark? You would burn my children at the stake if it served your cause. Don't lie to me and pretend you're doing this for the good of the realm. Ned's mouth tightened. I have no interest in harming your children, none of them. But Joffrey has threatened and hurt countless innocents. You know it. For a heartbeat, pain flickered in her gaze. Even Cersei, perhaps, recognized the truth about Joffrey, though love for her son blinded her. But that fleeting flicker vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by renewed venom. If you think this ends with your little coup, you are mistaken. She turned to Tywin, her voice trembling. Father, the rest of the realm will call you usurpers. They will never accept this. Tywin gave a curt nod to his guards, and two of them clasped Cersei's arms, holding her in place. She struggled, but they were strong. Ser Boros Blunt did nothing but stand there, arms limp, sword half lowered. We are finished here, Tywin declared. Take her to her chambers and keep her under guard. She is not to leave without my leave, nor is she to send ravens or messages unless they are first read and approved by me. Cersei's shrieks of indignation followed them out of the corridor, echoing off the high ceilings. Handmaids scattered, skirts swishing, while the queen cursed her father, cursed Ned Stark, cursed them all. The guards marched her away, ignoring her kicks and thrashing. Ned forced himself to watch a moment longer. Then he turned away, swallowing the sour taste in his mouth. He had no love for Cersei, but the rawness of that familial betrayal left him unsettled. Tywin, in contrast, looked as cold as ever. We must secure the rest of the Red Keep, he announced, addressing Ned and the assembled men. Have word sent to the gold cloaks that Joffrey is in custody. Any of them who resist shall be treated as traitors to the realm. One of the knights bowed his head. Yes, my lord. Tywin's eyes cut over to Ned. I assume you wish to see your daughter? Ned exhaled sharply. More than anything. Where is she? She's been confined to her quarters on the east side. We'll need to remove her from there before she tries something foolish, or before the city's chaos endangers her. Tywin fixed Ned with a calculating look. I will permit you to retrieve her with my guard's escort. But keep in mind, if something goes awry, we cannot risk letting her be used as a bargaining chip. The words were like a blow to Ned's chest, but he nodded. His voice came out rough. I understand. He turned to follow a different corridor, beckoning a small cluster of gold cloaks, loyal to Tywin, and a couple of his own northern guards who had entered the keep in secret. The corridor was lit with torches, though daylight had begun to seep through the arrow-slit windows. Down the winding halls, they passed tapestries bearing the sigils of former kings, and a row of long-forgotten suits of armor. The silence felt unnatural for King's Landing. They reached Sansa's door, two guards posted outside. The men recognized Ned and blanched. One was no older than 19, eyes darting from Ned's face to the Lannister sigil on the other men's armor. My lord, the lad stammered. We were told. Stand aside, Ned said firmly, surprising himself with how quickly authority came back to him in these halls. Open the door. The guard fumbled for keys, glancing at the older guard for confirmation. When none came, he obeyed. Metal jangled, the lock turned, and with a creak, the door swung wide. Inside was a modest antechamber with a small hearth, unlit. Sansa was there, seated in an armchair, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a pale green gown that clung to her slender frame, her red-brown hair neatly arranged in a maidenly braid, but her eyes were rimmed with the marks of sleepless nights. For an instant, she did not seem to register who stood at the threshold. Then she saw him, and everything in her face shattered. Father? She whispered, rising on unsteady feet. But no, how? Ned rushed forward, his heart hammering. He swept Sansa into his arms, feeling how thin she had become, how she trembled. "Sweet girl," he murmured into her hair, voice cracking. "It's all right. I'm here." Sansa clung to him with desperate force, sobbing softly. "They said you were dead. Joffrey said he'd had you executed. I prayed and prayed. But you prayed well," Ned said, tears burning in his own eyes. "I live, and now you're safe." She pulled back, eyes still overflowing. "What's happening? Why are these men here? Where is the king?" Ned couldn't find the right words to explain the coup, the alliance, the betrayal. He settled for the simplest truth. Joffrey is no longer king. He's been taken into custody. The Lannisters, some of them, have recognized the danger he poses. "Lord Tywin has helped free me, and I've come for you." Sansa's face paled. "Does that mean the Queen will?" Ned squeezed her hand. "The Queen is contained." He could not say arrested without remembering the fury in Cersei's eyes. Sansa's fear was still plain to see, so Ned forced a gentler tone. "We will take you away from here, back north or wherever is safest. Joffrey can harm you no longer." She nodded, eyes downcast, tears sliding down her cheeks. A swirl of shame and relief warred in her expression. "He was so cruel. I tried to be a good lady, to do as I was told, but he killed people just to see me cry." She swallowed, her shoulders stiffening as if she recalled a fresh wave of horrors. "I don't care what happens to him. I just want to go home." Ned pulled her close again. "We'll leave soon. For now, we'll gather in the throne room. Tywin means to address the city. Some formal declaration. I want you by my side for your own protection." The mention of Tywin made her tremble. "He's the Queen's father." Ned tried to keep his tone reassuring. "He is indeed. But for now, that is in our favor. Come." They left the room, with a pair of Tywin's guards leading them, all the while scanning corners for hidden threats. Sansa clung to Ned's arm, her face weary but determined not to break down in front of strangers. One of Ned's northern guards offered her a nod of respect. Sansa gave a timid smile. Even that small courtesy heartened Ned. This nightmare might be ending, in part, for his child. Outside, the corridors were busier now. The news of a power shift had spread through the Red Keep like wildfire, but confusion reigned. Servants hurried about, eyes lowered, uncertain which lords or ladies were in control. Several gold cloaks lingered in uncertain clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Tywin had anticipated some measure of chaos, but controlling it would take every ounce of cunning he possessed. At last, they made their way toward the throne room. Tywin was already there, flanked by Tyrion on one side and a handful of Lannister knights on the other. The colossal doors stood open. Inside, sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the iron throne perched atop the dais. That twisted seat of swords looked as menacing as ever, an ugly monument to conquest. And it was conspicuously empty. Word had traveled, and some curious courtiers and city functionaries were drifting into the hall. More gold cloaks formed a line along the perimeter, their expressions a mixture of confusion and forced obedience. Tyrion was speaking softly to a man in the robes of a royal steward. The imp's sharp eyes flicked up when Ned approached, registering Sansa's presence. "Lady Sansa," Tyrion said, voice gentle, "I'm relieved to see you safely delivered to your father." Sansa, unaccustomed to kindness from a Lannister, managed a small curtsy. "Thank you, my lord." Tywin, standing near the dais, cut an imposing figure even without his typical red cloak. A hush fell across the scattered courtiers as he raised a gauntlet hand. "Gather round," he said. "We shall have order in the throne room." A trembling steward stepped forward, clearing his throat to announce Tywin, but the Lord of Casterly Rock simply waved him aside. He wanted no grand introduction, apparently only immediate compliance. More onlookers trickled in, knights and minor lords who had lingered in King's Landing seeking royal favor. The High Septon was conspicuously absent. Perhaps he had heard rumor of the coup and barred himself in the Great September Varys, the spymaster, was likewise nowhere to be seen. Peter Baelish was also missing, almost certainly off spinning secrets to see which way the wind was blowing. Ned saw Pycelle shuffle in, half hidden behind a column. The old Grand Maester peered about nervously, wringing his hands. Once enough of a crowd had assembled to witness, Tywin mounted 2 steps toward the Iron Throne, turning to face them. He did not sit. "Lords and ladies of the court," he began, his voice carrying, "I stand before you to announce that Joffrey Baratheon is no longer your king. He has been found unfit to rule, both by proof of his illegitimate birth and by the damage he has wrought upon this city." A murmur rippled through the crowd, though many had suspected as much. Ned watched their faces. Surprise, fear, some relief. Not a single person cried out in protest. That, in itself, told volumes about Joffrey's popularity. Tywin pressed on. "As Warden of the West and Lord of Casterly Rock, I assumed the role of Hand of the King at the late Robert Baratheon's request. In that capacity I have done all I could to guide the realm, only to find Joffrey's rule untenable. Therefore, in concert with Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell, Warden of the North, we have moved to depose the false king. Joffrey is in custody, awaiting the realm's judgment." Heads turned. Some stared at Ned Stark. Others found themselves whispering to each other about the bizarre alliance. Stark and Lannister, side by side. But Ned stepped forward, feeling Sansa's hand clutching his sleeve. "I stand by these words," Ned said, raising his voice so it would carry. "Robert Baratheon was my friend, and I served as hand under him until the hour of his death. I discovered that Joffrey and his siblings were not Robert's trueborn children. This truth was suppressed, and I was imprisoned, my life nearly forfeit. The realm has been betrayed by those who sought to keep Joffrey on the throne." Pycelle shuffled forward, mouth agape. But, my lord, we must follow the line of succession. If Joffrey is not—" He fell silent under Tywin's icy glare. "A new king or queen will be determined," Tywin said. "We will consult the great houses, the faith, and the laws of the realm. But let there be no doubt, Joffrey Baratheon is a pretender. The city is now under the governance of Lord Eddard Stark and myself. Any who defy this rightful authority will be dealt with as traitors." At that, some of the more timid courtiers dropped to one knee, or at least bowed their heads. Others followed suit, as it became clear there was no immediate rescue from this new regime. Tyrion's expression was carefully neutral, though he did not hide a flicker of satisfaction. It was evident he believed this route preferable to seeing Joffrey remain king. Just then, a loud voice rang out from the back of the hall. "And what of the queen?" Heads turned to see Ser Meryn Trant standing in the doorway, his hands bound by Tywin's men, who must have dragged him in to face the new order. He glared around the hall, white cloak stained with dust and sweat. "Queen Cersei remains the lawful queen regent." Tywin cut him off. "Cersei is confined to her chambers, pending trial for conspiracy and other crimes. She will not be permitted to influence events until the question of her role is resolved." Anxious whispers spread, many pairs of eyes darting from Tywin to Ned. Some were already calculating how to best curry favor in this upheaval. Ned could almost see them measuring the distance between themselves and the dais, trying to guess which side would be safer to flatter. That was the nature of the court in King's Landing. Loyalty could be traded on a whim if it meant survival. A hush followed. Then, in a voice that resonated through the throne room, Tywin made his final pronouncement. "As of this dawn, Joffrey Baratheon is removed from his seat. No man is to name him king. Obey my command and Lord Stark's in the name of the realm. Defiance will not be tolerated." He gestured to the gold cloaks. "Clear the hall." The guards moved forward, prodding the onlookers back through the massive doors. The courtiers went willingly. None seemed eager to question Tywin's authority, especially not with Ned Stark standing at his side. Soon only a few of Tywin's sworn men, Ned's handful of Northmen, and Tyrion remained. Pycelle lingered uncertainly, but a glare from Tywin sent the Grand Maester scuttling away like a crab. When the chamber had mostly emptied, Ned guided Sansa out of the path of the exiting crowd. She looked pale, overwhelmed by the chaos of it all. Tywin's men began methodically securing the Red Keep, posting new guards, dismissing those who might still be loyal to Joffrey, searching for hidden pockets of resistance. Already, ravens would be flying from the rookery to every major house in Westeros, bearing the news that Joffrey had been deposed and that Tywin and Ned were in control of King's Landing. Tyrion stepped close to Ned, his voice low. "My father wants to make certain the city watch stays firmly in our hands. If you've men you trust, send them to the barracks. We cannot allow confusion to fester. One rumor of Joffrey's release, and the city might riot." Ned nodded, sending word through one of his captains. Then he turned back to Sansa. "Soon, I will see you out of this city. Your mother and brother are nearby, in the Riverlands. You'll be safe with them." "I want that," she whispered. "I never want to see this place again." Ned patted her hand gently. "I know. For now, stay with me until we're certain all is calm. I won't let you out of my sight." Sansa nodded, tears of relief glistening again. Ned wished, fervently, that Arya could be found as well. He hadn't had the chance to ask if she was within the city. If she had fled, where might she be? He could only hope that word of his survival would find her ears and bring her out of hiding. Moments later, Tywin joined them, face drawn and grim, though not exactly triumphant. He gave Sansa a curt nod. "My lady," he said quietly, "I trust your father has explained matters." She bowed her head, still trembling in the presence of the Lannister patriarch. "Aye, yes, my lord." Tywin turned back to Ned. "There is much to settle. A new King's Council, for one. We'll need to decide whether we support Tommen as heir or seek to legitimize Stannis as Robert's successor." He studied Ned's face. "I recall your earlier stance. Do you still believe Stannis has the best claim?" Ned swallowed. "By rights, yes. Stannis is Robert's true heir. Tommen is—" He hesitated, glancing at Sansa. Tommen might also be considered a child of incest. But in the swirl of these politics, it wouldn't be the first time a questionable lineage was brushed aside for the sake of stability. Tommen was younger, kind-hearted, and pliable, making him an easier puppet for men like Tywin to manipulate. Ned weighed his words carefully. Stannis is not known for mercy. If he learns that House Lannister orchestrated this removal of Joffrey without his involvement, he may take offense, and war might still come. Tywin's gaze was flinty. War with Stannis would be a trifling matter compared to letting Joffrey remain on the throne. However, Stannis has a narrow sense of right and wrong. If we do not bend the knee to him, he might indeed challenge our authority. Tyrion approached, hearing the last of the conversation. "If you make Stannis the king, father, do you believe he'll let House Lannister hold as much power as we do now?" His tone was dry. "I suspect he'll punish us for our role in Robert's death, and for the incest he'll claim as a moral stain. He might even demand your head for fathering the queen who produced these bastards." Ned watched Tywin's reaction. It was subtle, but a muscle in Tywin's jaw twitched. "Stannis's justice is a matter of concern," Tywin admitted. "He might spare my life if I present him the crown, but he'd likely strip our house of many privileges. That cannot stand." He paused, eyes narrowing in calculation. "Though if Lord Stark makes a compelling plea for Stannis's mercy, that might mitigate the outcome." Ned stiffened. "You want me to speak on your behalf?" "That was not our agreement, Lannister." Tywin gave a thin smile. "Our agreement was to remove Joffrey for the good of the realm. That is done. The question of who next wears the crown was never settled. If we go to war with Stannis, a great many will die. I assumed you wouldn't wish that." Ned could not deny it. "I don't want bloodshed, but if you attempt to place Tommen on the throne by ignoring Stannis entirely, you risk civil war with the Stormlands. Stannis's fleet and his hold on Dragonstone could strangle King's Landing. The city is already wounded from conflict. Do you truly wish to risk another siege?" Tywin's gaze flicked to Tyrion, then back to Ned. "No, I do not, which is why we must approach this carefully." He spoke as though every word were a piece on a Sivas board. "Stannis is not beloved among the southern lords. but he commands fear. We might propose a compromise that grants him a position of power, hand of the king perhaps, while placing Tommen as the figurehead. The realm would be calmed by the notion of a child king guided by a stern but just hand. And we, of course, ensure that the boy remains well protected, and that Stannis does not overreach. That is folly, Ned snapped, though he kept his voice low for Sansa's sake. Stannis does not compromise like that. You think he'll consent to rule behind a child who has no real claim to the throne? Tywin's lips thinned. He might, if the alternative is open war that could cost him what little he has left. Better to be hand in a stable kingdom than a king of ash and bones. Tyrion gave a non-committal shrug. You might be right, father, or you might not. Stannis is nothing if not stubborn. Ned looked away, exhaling, trying to quiet the swirl of frustration in his chest. This was the price of forging an alliance with Tywin Lannister. Practicalities took precedence over pure honor. But the realm will bleed if we don't tread lightly, he reminded himself. And they had just come through one nightmare, another would be too high a price. He felt Sansa's hand tighten on his arm. He forced a calmer tone. If there is to be a council to decide who sits the throne, I will attend. But my first priority is seeing my daughter out of the city, and ensuring her safety if the city descends into further chaos. Tywin nodded briskly. Very well. Lady Sansa can depart for the Riverlands at once, if you like. However, your presence here is still vital. If the North sees that you and I are cooperating, it lends legitimacy to this new regime. We cannot have you vanish the moment King's Landing is secured. Ned considered. He wanted to leave with Sansa, to wrap her in northern cloaks and ride straight for Riverrun or Moat Cailin. But that might tear open the fragile alliance. I will remain a few more days at least, he finally said, hating himself for the concession. But I want an escort for Sansa. Men I trust, men from the north. Tywin looked to a tall Lannister knight wearing a golden lion helm. Ser Martin, see to it that Lord Stark's men are given fresh horses and provisions. Lady Sansa departs for the Riverlands by midday. Then Tywin's eyes shifted to Ned. Your wife is in the Riverlands, yes? She and your son have rallied the Northmen near the Twins. Perhaps it is best that Lady Sansa joins them there, or meets them on the road. Sansa seemed to perk up at that. Mother and Robb, yes father, please. I want to see them as soon as I can. Ned stroked her hair gently, wishing the moment were more peaceful. We'll arrange it, I promise. Tyrion cleared his throat. I'll have a small retinue see her safely out of the city, under your men's lead, of course. Perhaps Bronn or a few other reliable sellswords in my employ can supplement. The roads are not always kind. Ned grimaced, not fully trusting sellswords. But Tyrion at least had proven to hold no personal grudge against Sansa. With the city's watch in flux, it might be wise to have men who were used to dealing with brigands. Very well, he said. But none who might harm her. Tyrion gave a sardonic bow. I'd sooner harm myself. Tywin studied the Iron Throne for a moment, as if considering whether to climb its steps. Then he turned to Tyrion and Ned, dropping his voice. We must do this quickly. Send out ravens summoning the major lords to attend a great council in King's Landing. Stannis, the Tyrells, the Martells, and the rest. If they refuse, so be it. We'll send word that Joffrey is deposed and that the question of the crown remains open, pending the realm's consensus. If Stannis chooses war, that is his decision. Ned quietly absorbed the implications. A great council reminiscent of the time after the death of the last Targaryen kings. In theory, the lords of the realm would come to decide the next ruler. In practice, such councils were rife with bargains and backroom deals. The fact that Tywin was suggesting it meant that he hoped to keep control by persuading or intimidating enough lords to side with him. A new wave of fatigue crashed over Ned. He had been a prisoner, starved and threatened, only to emerge into a conspiratorial alliance that might set all of Westeros ablaze. Yet it was better than letting Joffrey butcher the realm. Very well, Ned managed. I will affix my seal to these ravens, if that is what it takes to ensure no more blood is shed. Tywin nodded. Good. Then we shall settle the matter as quickly as possible. He glanced around, as if noticing the handful of Lannister guards still present. "Leave us," he snapped, and the men bowed and retreated. "Tyrion, fetch parchment and a quill. We'll draft these summons with Lord Stark's input." Tyrion dipped his head. "At once, father." He paused only to offer Sansa a faint, kind smile before he hurried off, footsteps echoing against the marble floor. That left Ned standing by the dais with Sansa and Tywin. The great emptiness of the throne room expanded around them. The Iron Throne loomed overhead, a silent watcher. For a moment, Ned wondered if the swords in that seat remembered all the blood spilled for the right to sit there. Aegon's conquests, Maegor's cruelty, the Targaryen feuds, Robert's rebellion. Now a new chapter was being written, with alliances twisted in ways no one could have foreseen. He felt the invisible weight of all those who had fought, died, or betrayed their way to power. Tywin's voice roused him from his reverie. "We do what we must," the old lion said, as though reading Ned's thoughts. "The realm can no longer abide a mad boy king. And you, Lord Stark, can no longer abide illusions of perfect honor in a city like this." Sansa's hold on Ned's arm tightened, as though for comfort. Ned inhaled, eyes settling on the throne. "No," he said softly. "No illusions remain. Only the wish that enough good might come of this to spare our families any more pain." Tywin's gaze was cold, but he gave a solemn nod. "We are in agreement, then." He stepped back, folding his arms. "Very well. Once Tyrion returns, we dispatch the ravens. Then we see how quickly Stannis or the others respond." Ned found himself gazing again at Sansa, at her trembling shoulders. She was trying so valiantly to keep her composure. He leaned toward her and murmured, "You need not stand here longer, sweet one. Go with Ser Martin. He'll find quarters for you while we finish this. After that, you'll be prepared to ride." Her eyes flooded with relief. "Thank you, father." They exchanged a final embrace before she followed Ser Martin out. Ned prayed that she would indeed be free of this viper's nest soon. His nightmares had been filled with the sight of her on the steps of Baelor's September, at Joffrey's mercy. Now that fate seemed averted, but new perils always lurked in Westeros. He could only trust the men he'd personally chosen to guard her. Tyrion returned shortly with parchment, quills, and ink. He laid them out on a wooden table near one of the pillars. Tywin wasted no time dictating letters, leaving spaces for Ned to add his seal. They wrote to Mace Tyrell at Highgarden, to Doran Martell in Dorne, to Balon Greyjoy, albeit with reluctance, in the Iron Islands, to Edmure Tully at Riverrun, and to the Lords of the Vale who might speak in Lysa Arryn's stead. Each letter demanded their presence at King's Landing to decide the new line of succession. Ned marked each with the direwolf of House Stark. Tywin affixed the golden lion for House Lannister. The two seals together on the parchment was a sight that would startle half the kingdom. Then the letters were handed to a steward who stood pale-faced under Tywin's grim orders. "Send them at once." The man scurried away. When it was done, Tywin rubbed a hand over his brow, tension pressing lines into his forehead. "We must keep watch day and night. Cersei will scheme. If Jaime returns." He broke off, glancing at Ned. Jaime Lannister was still in the field, or possibly somewhere in the Riverlands skirmishing with Robb's forces. Ned had heard that Jaime had been captured once but managed to escape. Now, with the news that Tywin had dethroned Joffrey, where would Jaime's loyalty lie? He was famously devoted to Cersei and to their children. He might well ride to King's Landing to free Joffrey and kill Ned Stark. "We cannot discount your son Robb's stance either," Tywin went on, pacing. "He might still be ill at ease about our arrangement. I take it you trust him not to break the truce." Ned's answer came from the heart. "Robb is honorable. If I assure him this is done for the sake of peace and Sansa's safety, he will stand down. But he is also young and proud, and he has men in his ear. If they suspect a trick, or if you betray me in any way, war will follow." Tywin's expression did not shift. "Then I shall be careful not to betray you." He let out a measured breath. "We had best prepare for the arrival of the other lords, if they come, or else for war. Go, Lord Stark. Rest." You've earned it after all you've suffered. I suspect we have little time for sleep before the next crisis arises." Ned wanted to scoff at the notion that Tywin was granting him permission, but instead he merely inclined his head. "A brief rest, then. I will check on Sansa, ensure she's safe, and then, yes, I'll try to sleep." He paused, looking Tywin directly in the eye. "I trust you'll keep your word." Tywin did not flinch. "I will, assuming you do the same." They parted, each weighed by the knowledge that their unholy alliance might well save the realm, or destroy it, should it falter. Ned found his way to a smaller suite of rooms once reserved for lesser nobles. It had a stiff bed, a single table, and a narrow window offering a view of the keep's courtyard. There, from the window, Ned watched the swirl of men and horses, the gold cloaks moving about, Lannister knights on patrol, a few northern guards near the stables. The city beyond the walls remained as it always was, dusty, crowded, and alive with rumor. Soon, the capital would learn that Joffrey was removed. How the people might react, relief, fear, or chaos, was anyone's guess. He washed himself at a small basin, the tepid water stinging his raw wrists. He dressed in fresh clothes provided by a steward who had rummaged up a plain tunic of gray wool. Even the simple act of washing felt surreal after his weeks in the dungeon. When he looked in the mirror of polished metal, he saw hollows beneath his eyes, lines etched deeper into his brow, and streaks of gray in his hair that had not been so pronounced before. "I have aged a decade in mere months," he thought grimly. He sank onto the bed, meaning to rest only a few minutes, but exhaustion dragged him under quickly. His dreams were a jumble of memories. Robert laughing in the crypts of Winterfell, Joffrey brandishing a crossbow, Sansa in tears, Arya lost in the crowd. He saw Cersei sneering, Tywin forging steel in some dark place, Robb shouting at a battlefield. Faces swirled and blurred, until a knock at the door drew him back to consciousness. He sat up, blinking. The angle of the sunlight had shifted, indicating at least an hour or two had passed. He rubbed his eyes. "Come in," he said, voice hoarse. A Northman he recognized, a bannerman of House Stark, his name was Barthel, stepped inside, bowing. "My lord, forgive the intrusion, but news from outside. The small folk have begun gathering at the gates, demanding to know what's happened. They heard Joffrey was taken prisoner. Some are cheering, others are confused. The gold cloaks are uneasy." Ned rose, pulling on his boots. "I'll come at once. Where is Lord Tywin?" "In the solar on the eastern Cid. He sent word that he expects you there. Lord Tyrion is with him." Ned nodded. "Very well. Thank you. Did my daughter set out safely yet?" Barthel smiled slightly. "Aye, my lord. She departed under good guard, with Ser Martin Lannister and 2 of your men. They should clear the city by now, heading north by the Rosby Road." A wave of relief washed over Ned. "That is good. Lead the way." They navigated a maze of corridors, passing a few courtiers who stared at Ned with open awe or fear. No one attempted to stop him or question him, a stark contrast to the last time he had wandered these halls as a prisoner. The door to the solar stood ajar, revealing a chamber lined with windows that overlooked the city below. Ned stepped in to find Tywin, Tyrion, and a pair of gold cloak captains hunched over a table that displayed a rough map of the city's districts. Tywin straightened. "Lord Stark, good. The small folk are stirring. We need to quell the panic or harness it." Ned took a breath. "Harness it? How so?" Tyrion drummed his fingers on the table. "If the people believe that Joffrey's removal comes with a promise of fairer treatment, lighter taxes, or better governance, they might rally behind this new regime. But if they think a new tyrant replaces the old, the city could erupt into riots, as it did under Joffrey's father in times past." Tywin nodded. "We must show them stability. This is where your presence matters, Stark. The small folk recall Robert's fondness for you. If they see you alive, standing with me, it might quell suspicion that this is merely a Lannister power grab." Ned swallowed a sarcastic retort. "Of course it is a Lannister power grab, but a necessary one, perhaps. Then let us speak to them." Show them we have no intention of raising their taxes or letting them starve. Tyrion's lips curled in a faint smile. A demonstration of unity, yes. Go among them if you like, or address them from the castle gates. A fatherly, I have returned to ensure justice for King Robert's city, might do wonders. Ned frowned. He had never enjoyed theatrics, but he understood the necessity. If it keeps the peace, I'll speak. He turned to Tywin. Is that your wish as well? Tywin's face was unreadable. It is. I will stand beside you. Between your sense of honor and my name's weight, we might secure a few days of calm while we wait for the great lords to respond. And so it was decided. That very afternoon, a raised platform was hastily constructed near the Red Keep's gates, and a small retinue of gold cloaks and Lannister soldiers formed a cordon around it, keeping the throng of small folk at bay. Word had spread quickly. Lord Stark has returned from the dead and dethroned the boy king. The crowd was thick, a sea of curious faces. Some craned their necks to get a glimpse of Ned. Others shouted questions he could not decipher. A few tossed bits of rotten fruit at the mention of Lannisters, but overall, the atmosphere was more uncertain than hostile. Tyrion climbed the platform first, raising his hands for silence. The crowd's din subsided marginally. Tywin stepped up next, regal in his dark cloak, flanked by two bannermen brandishing the lion sigil. Finally, Ned ascended, scanning the mass of people. He spied tradesmen, laborers, fisherwomen, children perched on barrels or hoisted onto parents' shoulders. Anxiety clenched his gut. He was no orator, yet the city demanded answers. Tyrion's voice rang out. Good people of King's Landing, you all have heard of the turmoil that has plagued us. Our beloved King Robert's death left us with a boy on the throne ill-suited to rule. I say this not in idle insult, but with deep regret. You have suffered under the lash of unfair taxes, cruelty, and fear. No more. A ripple of murmurs swept the crowd. Some cheered half-heartedly. Others kept silent, waiting. Tyrion gestured to Ned. Here stands Eddard Stark, the man who served King Robert faithfully for years. He has returned to us, very much alive, despite the lies told by those who would keep him silent. Ned stepped forward, heart pounding. People of King's Landing, he began, voice carrying better than he'd expected. You knew King Robert. He was a bold man, a friend to many, and I served him with loyalty. When he died, the crown passed to Joffrey Baratheon. But I learned that Joffrey was no Baratheon at all. He was not Robert's son. I spoke out, and for that, I was imprisoned. Gasps and shouts of "Bastard! The boy's a bastard!" erupted in pockets. Others looked skeptical, while still others hooted in approval, as if they had always suspected Joffrey was cursed. Ned pressed on. I do not stand here to condemn the entire house that ruled King's Landing. I stand here to tell you this. Joffrey has been deposed because he was cruel and unjust. He would have plunged this city into endless war. We have removed him for the good of all. A new ruler will be chosen, wisely, and with your welfare in mind. Tywin took a half-step forward, the sun catching the golden thread on his sleeve. Know this, your taxes will not rise. Your persons will not be harmed for protesting injustice. I vow to see that bread and provisions reach the poorest districts in the city, that no one starves under my watch. Obey the laws and keep the peace, and we will guide you to a better tomorrow. An uneasy hush followed. Slowly, a few cheers rose in the distance, perhaps from those who found the notion of removing Joffrey appealing. Others stood stoic, arms folded, waiting to see if these new promises would be any better kept than the old ones. Tyrion leaned to Ned and murmured, It's not the most rousing ovation, but it may suffice. Ned nodded, then raised his voice a final time. If you have concerns, they will be heard. If you have grievances, they will be addressed. The days of terror are ending. Peace is our goal, for the sake of all who live in King's Landing. With that, Tywin nodded to the gold cloaks. They began steering the crowd back to allow the trio to descend the platform. A swirl of voices followed them, some calling out questions about, what will happen to Joffrey? Or will the queen be punished? Ned could not stay to answer each. He let the guards guide him away, feeling the press of hundreds of eyes upon him. It was a relief to step back behind the gates, into the Red Keep's courtyard, and away from the chaotic throng. "It is done," Tywin said quietly, glancing over his shoulder at the watchers beyond the bars. "Now we see if it holds. Perhaps the mob will remain content for a time." Tyrion shrugged. "Bread and circuses, as they say, or bread and illusions. We'll need to keep them appeased. That means ensuring that your men do not harass the small folk unnecessarily." Ned could not argue. He studied the father and son pair. Tyrion seemed thoughtful, even sympathetic to the plight of the common people. Tywin, for all his harshness, recognized the necessity of a calm city for stable rule. The arrangement might hold for a time, so long as no spark ignited these uneasy masses. The days that followed were rife with maneuvering. Ned oversaw a reorganization of some city watch stations, placing northern men in a few key posts so that not all power belonged to the Lannisters. Tywin allowed this grudgingly, presumably because he needed Ned's continuing cooperation. Cersei raged from her confinement, sending curses and tear-stained threats to anyone who would listen. Jaime remained absent, rumored to be somewhere between Harrenhal and Riverrun. No one knew if or when he would appear. Gradually, ravens began returning with replies from various lords. Mace Tyrell wrote a polite but non-committal letter, claiming he would attend the Great Council soon, though Ned suspected the Tyrells would weigh carefully which side offered them greater advantage. Edmure Tully, on behalf of House Tully, agreed to travel to King's Landing if safe passage could be guaranteed. Balon Greyjoy's letter was openly scornful, as if the Iron Islands might try to exploit the chaos. Doran Martell's missive came couched in formal courtesies, with no promise to attend but no refusal either. The most crucial response was Stannis Baratheon's. It arrived late one evening, delivered by a knight in golden armor who had ridden hard from Dragonstone. Ned and Tywin were in the Solar, reviewing the day's developments, when the knight was shown in. He handed over a sealed parchment, which Tywin opened at once. The Lord of Casterly Rock read it silently, his eyes skimming each line, face growing stony. He passed the parchment to Ned. Ned took it, noting Stannis's familiar, brusque penmanship. "To Lord Tywin Lannister and Lord Eddard Stark. You speak of a great council to decide who should rule, yet the rightful king needs no council to confirm his claim. I, Stannis Baratheon, am King Robert's lawful heir. Joffrey was a bastard, which I always knew. You have done the realm a favor by confining him, but that does not excuse your presumption to hold the capital. Send me the boy and his mother so that justice may be done. Bend the knee to me or face the consequences of treason. I will give you 1 moon's time to surrender King's Landing peacefully. After that, I come with fire and sword. King Stannis Baratheon." Ned felt his heart sink. Stannis was no man for half measures. "I warned you," he said quietly, glancing at Tywin. "He will not compromise." Tywin's mouth was a grim line. "Then we must prepare for war, or see if we can persuade him otherwise." Tyrion, who had read the letter over Ned's shoulder, muttered, "We'd best send him a reply explaining that if he attacks the city, he dooms thousands of innocents, though I doubt that will shift his resolve. He sees himself as the anointed king by law, and all else be damned." Ned looked again at the parchment. The mention of 1 moon's time was an ultimatum. Does he have the forces to besiege the city? Dragonstone is not large, but he might draw upon the Stormlands. How many are loyal to him? Tywin exhaled. Many of the lords in the Stormlands will follow Stannis if he claims Robert's rightful seat. He also has ships, fewer than the royal fleet once boasted, but enough to blockade the harbor. With some cunning, he might strangle the city from the sea while attacking by land. Tyrion tapped a finger on the map. 1 moon's time, he says. That's weeks to muster an army and sail up the Blackwater, or land at the coast near the city. If the Tyrells join him or even remain neutral, Stannis might gain a comfortable advantage. We cannot discount that possibility. Ned felt the weight of it all pressing on him. Another war was the last thing the realm needed. The city, already battered by Joffrey's misrule, might not survive a protracted siege. People would starve. Disease would spread. All the talk of a better tomorrow would crumble in blood and ash. He looked at Tywin. We cannot simply ignore Stannis. He has the strongest claim by law. If we don't yield the throne to him, we risk destruction. Tywin's eyes glinted with suppressed anger, as though the suggestion itself were an affront. Yield the throne to a man who would cast me in chains? Maybe strip House Lannister of all we have built over generations? He shook his head sharply. No, there must be another way. Tyrion's gaze shifted to Ned. Is there any chance, Lord Stark, that you might speak on behalf of mercy? Perhaps if you wrote to Stannis personally and appealed to some bond you have with him. Ned nearly laughed. Stannis and I have never shared any bond. I was closer to his brother Renly. Stannis is determined, stern. He respects the law, that is true, but he also believes he is the law. Perhaps I can try, but I doubt he will budge unless we concede that he is rightful king. Tywin ran a hand across his jaw. If we name him king outright, we lose any leverage. He'll demand Joffrey's head, and possibly Cersei's as well. That is something I cannot allow. The silence that followed was palpable. Ned remembered the terms of their alliance. They were to dethrone Joffrey to save the realm, and in return, Sansa would be spared and House Stark would be safe. If Tywin refused to release Joffrey to Stannis, then the city was likely to burn. Ned forced himself to speak the harsh truth. If it comes to a siege, countless innocents will die, and Sansa's safety might be in peril again. My daughter will not be in the city, but if Stannis storms the gates, the aftermath could be brutal for any Lannister ally. Tywin did not waver. Then we must ensure it does not come to that. If Stannis attacks, we will resist as we must. But perhaps there is a chance we can gain an ally strong enough to oppose him. Mace Tyrell, for instance. If the Tyrells side with us, they might challenge the Stormland Lords. Then Stannis would be forced to negotiate. Ned clenched his jaw. He disliked the notion of forging further alliances that might sow more chaos. That means promising the Tyrells something like a marriage alliance, or the seat of the hand, or worse. Tyrion scratched his scarred eyebrow. Marjorie Tyrell could wed Tommen. A younger king in name might unite the houses. Tyrell gold and Lannister gold, with Stark backing. We present a strong front. Ned nearly groaned. Another child betrothal, another scheme to keep power in Lannister hands. But he saw the logic. If the Tyrells believed they could become the new royal family, by marrying Marjorie to Tommen, they might throw their substantial might behind Tywin's cause, thus outnumbering Stannis. The entire notion felt like a nest of vipers. But what was the alternative? Let the city be sacked, watch thousands die, and see Stannis impose a harsh, unrelenting rule that might lead to purges of all who had once served Joffrey. Before we embark on that path, Ned said slowly, I will at least attempt to reason with Stannis. I'll write him a letter, urging him to come to King's Landing in peace to attend the Great Council. He might refuse, but I have to try. Tywin's face was impassive. As you wish. In the meantime, we will quietly reach out to the Tyrells. If Stannis insists on war, I will not let the city fall without a fight. That final note hung in the air like a funeral bell. Ned dipped his head, too weary to argue further. I will draft that letter tonight. They dismissed the Gold Cloak captains with instructions to heighten patrols and quell any sign of unrest. Tyrion left to handle some immediate concerns with the city's finances. Tywin lingered, regarding Ned with an unreadable expression. You look troubled, Stark, he said at last, in a tone almost resembling curiosity. Ned met his gaze. I agreed to help remove Joffrey, because I believed it was the only way to spare my daughters and save the realm from a cruel tyrant. Now we stand on the brink of another war. Nothing feels saved. Tywin's stare was unwavering. Wars are not always fought by choice. Sometimes they are fought by necessity. If Stannis chooses to press his claim by sword, we must answer. Do you regret your decision to join me? Ned gave a bitter smile. If I had not joined you, I would be headless, my daughters in torment, and the realm in Joffrey's clutches. That would be worse, I think. But I cannot rejoice at the path we're on. Tywin said nothing more, only inclined his head as he turned away. Ned left the solar, his mind weighed down by the uncertain future. He wanted nothing more than to gather his family, Sansa, Arya, wherever she was, Robb, Bran, Rickon, and Catelyn, and vanish north beyond the moors and fields to Winterfell's safety. But Winterfell itself was threatened by the storms swirling across the realm. The Game of Thrones had ensnared him again, and the stakes were as high as ever. That night, Ned sat at a small wooden desk, a single candle flickering. He penned a letter to Stannis. "Your Grace, I address you so because by law and blood, you hold the strongest claim to King Robert's throne. I once served your brother with deep loyalty. You know I am not a man of artifice or deceit. When I learned that Joffrey was not Robert's son, I intended to support you as the rightful heir. My reward was imprisonment and the threat of execution by Joffrey's orders. Now Joffrey has been removed and is held in custody. I ask you, in the name of the realm, to come to King's Landing to discuss a peaceful resolution. A great council of lords is being convened to formally decide the succession. No swords need be drawn if you wish to attend and present your claim. I will do all in my power to ensure your safety and a fair hearing. I understand you doubt the Lannisters, but I urge you not to condemn the entire city or the realm to warfare. We both seek justice. We both seek stability. Grant us the chance to forge it without the bloodshed of another rebellion." Signed, Eddard Stark, formerly Hand of the King, Warden of the North. He sealed it with the direwolf of House Stark, then handed it to a waiting courier. The man would sail for Dragonstone in the morning, if the weather allowed. Ned watched the courier leave, feeling no certainty that his words would sway Stannis. He will likely see this as a trap, or even if he believes my sincerity, he will believe Tywin Lannister capable of any betrayal. Yet Ned had to try. The following days were an uneasy lull. Ravens came and went, bearing the letters of lords who hedged their bets. Some pledged vague support, others demanded assurances of their lands or privileges. Meanwhile, the city's gates saw an influx of travelers. Spies, merchants, sellswords hoping to profit from the tension. Tywin tightened security, instructing the gold cloaks to inspect wagons for hidden arms. Tyrion rooted out at least one plot by ex-Kingsguard members loyal to Joffrey who intended to free the boy from his cell. They were hanged for treason, a grim reminder that pockets of loyalty to Joffrey still existed. Cersei, in her luxurious confinement, refused to eat for days, then reversed course and demanded a formal audience with Tywin. Ned heard from a guard that she had thrown a vase at Tywin's head, missing by inches, before he stormed out. Rumors said she was half-mad with rage, shrieking that Jaime would come for her, that House Lannister would pay for her humiliation. None of it changed her fate. She remained locked away, powerless to help her son. One damp afternoon, as Ned stood by a window overlooking the city, he spied a small band of riders approaching the gatehouse. They carried banners that snapped in the wind. Two were the sunburst of House Karstark, but the largest and most prominent was the gray direwolf of Stark. Ned's heart caught in his throat. Robb? Had Robb come in person? He hurried down to the courtyard with a retinue of his own men. When the gates swung open, in rode his eldest son, Robb Stark, flanked by a half-dozen northern knights. Robb's face was set in a determined frown, but Ned sensed relief mingled in his eyes as he spotted his father waiting. At once, Ned stepped forward, arms raised in greeting. Robb dismounted and embraced him. "Father," he said softly, "you live." For all that time we feared the worst. Pulling back, Robb's face was etched with an older, harder cast, but relief welled in his expression. "Mother sent me to confirm your alliance with Tywin Lannister. She feared it might be a trap or a forced arrangement." Ned squeezed Robb's shoulders. "It began as an uneasy arrangement, but we have found common cause, removing Joffrey from power, and Sansa has been freed, on her way to rejoin you and your mother." Robb's gaze flickered with gratitude. "Thank the gods." He glanced around the courtyard, noting the gold cloaks wearing subtle Lannister call. "Oars. You trust them?" Ned gave a weary shrug. "Trust? No. But we need them. Tywin has the city, and we have the moral authority to claim Joffrey's removal was just. Together, we might avert a larger war, unless Stannis forces one. Robb's jaw tightened. If he does, I'll stand with you, father. He paused, glancing aside. But the North named me king in the North. They will not so easily reverse that decision. Ned felt a pang of conflicting loyalties. I understand. But for the moment, I need you as a voice of reason, not a separatist demanding the North break away. If we ask the realm to unite behind a new king, whoever that may be, open talk of northern independence will splinter any hope of forging peace. Robb looked troubled. I gave my word to the lords who crowned me. How can I betray that? You are not betraying them, Ned said gently. You are biding your time. Should Stannis or another claim the throne, we can revisit the question of the North's status later, when the realm is not teetering on the brink of civil war. For now, help me keep the peace. Robb's eyes flicked with uncertainty, but at last he nodded. I'll do what I must. Ned gripped his son's hand firmly. Together, father and son strode into the Red Keep, aware that the sight of the young king in the North walking unchained alongside Ned Stark would set tongues wagging. More rumors would churn. House Stark truly stands with the Lannisters? Or is it a ploy? But Ned pressed forward. So long as they maintained a tenuous unity, Joffrey's tyranny was ended and the realm stood a chance of avoiding further slaughter. In the Grand Hall, they met Tywin. Robb regarded the Lord of Casterly Rock with guarded hostility, but he offered a polite bow for formality's sake. Tywin acknowledged him with a short inclination of the head, as though greeting a new piece in his grand chessboard arrangement. Lord Stark, Tywin said, addressing Robb in a clipped tone, ignoring the boy's self-crowned title. You honor us with your presence. I trust you have come to ensure your father remains safe and to see that no misunderstandings arise. Robb set his jaw. I have. I also came to see that my sister Sansa is out of this city, free of harm. Tywin's mouth twitched. She departed days ago as promised. She should be in the Riverlands by now under armed escort. You have my word no harm shall come to her. Ned broke in, sensing tension. Robb, Lord Tywin and I are discussing our next steps regarding Stannis Baratheon. I would value your counsel. Robb forced a nod. Very well. They retreated into a smaller council chamber. Tyrion was present, along with a few chosen northern lords, Rickard Karstark and Great Jon Umber among them, who had accompanied Robb. The Great Jon looked thoroughly disgruntled at finding himself inside the Red Keep without a blade drawn, but his loyalty to Robb had evidently won out. Tyrion poured wine for everyone, trying to ease the tension. Let's hope we can find a solution to this Stannis dilemma that does not involve burning half the city, he quipped. Robb's brow furrowed. Stannis's letter demands we yield or be crushed. Is that not correct? Tywin inclined his head. He has given us 1 moon's time. We have written back, inviting him to attend a great council. If he refuses, or if he attacks, we will have no choice but to defend the city. The Great Jon let out a growling laugh. Then let him come. We'll greet him with steel. The boy can see how northern men fight. Ned raised a hand to quell him. We want to avoid that bloodshed if possible. War would only tear the realm further apart. You, Lord Umber, have seen enough of our men lost already. Let us see if there's a path that spares us more graves. Tyrion sipped his wine, mismatched eyes flicking to Tywin. We have also begun quiet discussions with the Tyrells, to see if Marjorie might wed Tommen, who is a sweet boy of about 9. That would unite 2 powerful houses. With the Tyrell bannermen behind us, Stannis may be forced to stand down. Robb's hands curled into fists on the table. And if that does not work, do we just throw men at the walls, wait for Stannis to kill as many as he can, and pray we win? Tywin's face hardened. If it comes to that, yes. But our intention is to make Stannis see the hopelessness of his cause or compromise. If he senses a united front, Starks, Lannisters, Tyrells, he might relent to a negotiated settlement. Perhaps we can even name him Hand of the King, a concession that he sits the throne only after Tommen reaches majority, or something along those lines. Ned doubted Stannis would tolerate a puppet monarchy in front of him. But he recognized the plan's cunning. Let us not forget, the more Stannis is cornered, the more likely he is to respond with force. The man is not afraid of war. He prosecuted a siege against the Targaryens at Storm's End for a year, nearly starving to death. He won't balk at a desperate fight. Rickard Karstark slammed a fist onto the table. Then let him fight if that is his will. The North stands ready. Ned glanced around at the tension in the room. Honor and practicality tug us in opposite directions. He saw Tywin's set features, Tyrion's calculating stare, Robb's resolve, and the fierce loyalty of the Northern Lords. There seemed no easy path. Only choices that might stave off the worst outcome a little longer. At length Tywin tapped the table. We will proceed with our attempts to rally the Tyrells. We continue to send ravens to Stannis, offering him the chance to appear at the council. If he marches anyway, we gather our forces and defend the city. No more time shall be wasted. That ended the council. Tywin rose, looming as an imposing figure in the candlelit chamber, and departed, barking orders at a messenger. Tyrion gave Ned and Robb a small bow. Father seldom means we when he says it, but at least he sees the necessity of our combined strength. I'll see you both tomorrow, no doubt. He departed, leaving the Northern Lords alone. Robb turned to Ned, expression troubled. Father, I know you want peace, but if a war is inevitable, I would rather be prepared to strike first, or to stand with you openly, than wait for Tywin Lannister to lead me around by the nose. Ned placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. Patience, my son. This alliance was forged to save lives. Remember why we did it. I promise you, if war comes, we will face it on our terms, not as pawns of Tywin Lannister. Robb studied Ned's face, searching for reassurance. I trust you, father. Truly, I do. They clasped arms. Outside the chamber, the Red Keep's corridors stretched with flickering torches, the gloom reminiscent of Ned's old prison. He felt the threads of fate tightening around them all. Joffrey locked away, Cersei raging, Stannis threatening war, Tywin weaving alliances, the Tyrells lurking in the wings. One misstep could plunge the Seven Kingdoms into a conflagration worse than any since Robert's rebellion. Yet for now, Ned Stark was alive, Sansa freed, and Joffrey's cruel reign ended. It was a fragile hope he clung to as he walked with Robb through the corridors. I will do what I must, he thought, recalling the words he once spoke to Robert in the crypts of Winterfell. For the realm, for my family, and for all those who cannot fight for themselves. Let the gods judge me as they will. He prayed that the gods, old and new, were listening. If Westeros was to be spared, this alliance of enemies must hold. And if it broke, Ned feared that an ocean of blood would follow, drowning any chance for peace. He pushed aside the dread in his chest, focusing instead on the relief that one nightmare, the tyranny of Joffrey, was truly ended. Whatever new nightmares might loom, he was determined to face them with the stubborn honor and quiet resolve that had guided him through every darkness before. In that, Eddard Stark would never yield.